The man who taught others to walk again never spoke about how he lost the right to stand. In a gray building on the east side of Detroit, where the wind howled through broken windows and rust clung to bricks like regret, Silas Quinn worked alone. His hands moved with the quiet precision of someone who had rebuilt more than metal. He designed prosthetics for veterans' legs with carbon spring heels, knees that bent with grace, sockets molded to human warmth. To them, he was a genius, a gift, a man who saved what war had taken. But no one ever asked what life had taken from him, and Silas never told. Every morning, he rolled into the workshop before the city stirred. The clatter of tools, the hiss of heat against alloy, the occasional warbling of a radio left on too long, these were the only sounds that shared the room with him. No family photos on the wall, no medals, no past. Only the steady rhythm of making something whole out of what had been shattered. He had been called many things growing up. Weak, strange, a disappointment. But pig was the word that stayed. The last word his father threw at him before the push, before the darkness, before the fall that took his legs and everything else he thought he was. Silas had been 13, barely tall enough to reach the top shelf of the kitchen pantry, but already old enough to hide his drawings of another boy's smile beneath loose floorboards. His adoptive father, Thomas Quinn, was a decorated veteran, a man the town called a hero. But behind the garage door of their house in Bridge Hollow, he was something else. A man with fists that spoke louder than any lesson. A man who saw a son's softness as threat. And on a winter night no one in the town cared to remember, Thomas made sure that softness ended with silence. The hospital report said, accidental fall. Silas never spoke otherwise. They called it a miracle he survived. But when you've lost the part of you that lets you run, leap, dance, it's hard to call anything a miracle. After months in recovery, Silas disappeared. No goodbyes, no forwarding address. Just a name removed from the school registry, a bed left untouched, and a father who never visited the burn unit once. Detroit took him in not with warmth, but with indifference. That suited him. No one asked questions. He earned a GED in a community center, then apprenticed under a prosthetics technician who couldn't stop drinking long enough to remember the kid's name. That's how Silas learned, not through guidance, but through fixing what others broke, again and again. He didn't need love. He needed tools, steel, patience, and silence. But there was one thing he could never silence: the look in the eyes of people when they tried their new legs for the first time. That mixture of disbelief and fragile hope. Like standing was a language they had forgotten and suddenly remembered. Silas never joined the hugs. He nodded, smiled faintly, and turned away. But in that moment, something inside him stood taller than even he could explain. Years passed like seasons in a locked room. He got older, stronger. The pain dulled but never faded. And yet, there was a purpose to each cut, each mold, each footfall that left his workshop a little less broken than when it entered. He had become the man who gave people back their steps, but he still hadn't taken his own, and he still hadn't returned to Bridge Hollow. If stories of silent strength and the courage to heal speak to you, subscribe to Heart Stories. Every view helps us bring voices like Silas's into the light. Most people who walk it into Silas Quinn's workshop left with something new: an ankle that could bend again, a knee that didn't lock at every shift in weight, or simply the quiet courage to take one more step. But there were those rare days when someone walked in carrying something heavier than injury, something older, like memory. That morning, the air tasted like rust. The ceiling fan above buzzed with a limp effort, spinning half-heartedly in the spring heat. Silas was shaping a socket for a young Marine when the door creaked open. He didn't look up at first, until the voice cut through the static of the radio like a knife through old scar tissue. "I heard this is where people come to feel human again." Silas paused. The voice was deep, gravelly, with that particular Midwest tightness in its vowels. He turned slowly. The man in front of him leaned on two crutches. One pant leg hung empty, folded and pinned neatly. His chest carried a row of campaign medals. His jaw, a heavy stubble of gray. But it wasn't the medals or the limp that struck Silas still, it was the name etched into the form he handed over. Thomas Quinn. His heart didn't stop. It didn't race. It went eerily still, like a heartbeat waiting for permission to feel again. Thomas didn't recognize him. Of course he wouldn't. Silas had changed so much since the fire, since the surgeries, since the name change. Gone was the slender, shy boy who used to draw in the attic and hide bruises behind long sleeves. The man standing before him now wore prosthetics, so advanced they mimicked real bone rhythm. He moved with confidence. He had rebuilt himself literally from the waist down. And yet, the past hadn't forgotten its address. Thomas looked around the room and said, "I used to think losing a leg was the worst thing that could happen to a man. Turns out, it's losing the one person who could have forgiven you." Silas's breath caught in his chest. He wanted to scream, to throw something, to say, "You don't get to mourn what you broke." But he didn't. He nodded slightly and gestured to the consultation table, the same table where he'd helped dozens before him reclaim what the world had taken. He took measurements, he asked questions. Clinical, neutral, careful. Thomas, oblivious, talked about the war, about the rehab, about the boy he once fostered but lost to some foolishness. He didn't even remember the fall correctly. Said the boy must have slipped trying to run away after being caught with some filth in his notebook. He shook his head and muttered, "These days, kids call it a lifestyle. Back then, it was a shame." Silas's fingers froze around the cast mold. The shame wasn't his, it had never been. And yet, he had carried it like second skin for years, while Thomas had gone on parading as a hero in Bridge Hollow, collecting awards in pity in equal measure. When the fitting was done, Silas told him to return in 2 weeks. Thomas asked his name, and Silas lied. He gave only his first name, nothing more. After he left, Silas sat alone for hours. He didn't touch the tools, didn't drink water, just stared at the cast on the bench, the shape of the man who had tried to erase him. For the first time in over a decade, the past wasn't abstract. It was real. It had walked through his door and asked him for help. That night, Silas opened the locked drawer under his bed and pulled out a file labeled Bridge Hollow. It was filled with things he swore he'd never look at again: newspaper clippings, discharge papers, a photo burned at the edges with only a sliver of a boy's face left visible. He placed the cast mold on top of it and whispered, "You don't get to walk out of this with more than you walked in." But he didn't throw it away. He'd make the leg, the best one he'd ever crafted, because some ghosts don't disappear when ignored. They have to be walked to the door and shown their reflection. And this time, Silas would be the one holding the mirror. 2 weeks later, just as promised, Thomas Quinn returned. He arrived alone, without fanfare or company, wearing the same military jacket he always wore in photos, the one Silas used to stare at from behind the staircase railing, watching the way neighbors saluted him like a figure carved from granite. Only now the sleeves sagged slightly, the collar drooped, and his steps, supported by one temporary crutch in an old walking boot, carried the weight of something unspoken. Silas had prepared the prosthetic with meticulous care: titanium shaft, graphite-reinforced sole, a socket molded to accommodate aging skin and old fractures. It was a leg built for both movement and memory, but he had added something extra inside, hidden beneath the surface, invisible to the eye. A strip of flexible copper engraved with a date and a line for the boy you left at the bottom of the stairs. Thomas would never see it, but Silas needed it to be there. The fitting session was clinical, efficient. Silas avoided eye contact. Thomas talked less this time, only muttering occasional thanks under his breath as he tested balance and range. When the session ended, he stood upright for the first time since the injury. There was something eerie in the way he looked at himself in the mirror, as if he didn't recognize the man standing tall. Or perhaps, as if he didn't like what he saw. He turned to Silas and said, "You're good at what you do. Better than anyone else I've seen." Silas nodded once, then stepped back. The words rang hollow, but not meaningless. What happened next wasn't part of the plan. Thomas asked if Silas could accompany him for a walk, just once, to test the leg outside the sterile quiet of the workshop. Silas hesitated. Everything inside him screamed to say no, but he nodded. They walked in silence down the block, passing rusted fences, worn brick walls, the last remains of a once thriving factory town. And then Thomas broke the silence not with a question, but a confession. I used to dream about a kid I raised once. Don't remember much of his face anymore. But I remember the way he drew, always with charcoal, always shadows. One day I found a picture he made of me, with horns. Ugly thing, I threw it in the furnace. Silas kept walking, slower now. Thomas kept speaking. I said things I shouldn't have. Did worse, my wife left after that. Can't say I blame her. But I thought about the boy for years. Wondered if he lived, if he blamed me, if he ever learned to walk again. Silas stopped beside a lamppost. The wind tugged at his coat. He could feel his own breath trembling in his chest. Thomas looked at him and said, almost gently, "Some people don't deserve to be forgiven, but I'd like to know if he ever got to build something that lasted, something better than what I gave him." Silas turned to him slowly. His voice came low, steady, unshaken. "He did." Thomas froze, not in understanding, just in confusion. But Silas didn't explain. He simply pointed ahead toward the bus stop. "I think you can walk the rest of the way." Thomas nodded, quietly. That night, Silas returned to his empty apartment, locked the door, and finally let the tears fall. They weren't loud, just quiet, stubborn drops that traced the corners of a face carved by time, survival, and choices no child should have had to make. Then he stood up, crossed the room, and opened a wooden crate he hadn't touched in years. Inside was a half-assembled design, a prosthetic leg with brushed silver plating and curved etching along the calf. It was supposed to be part of a display for a community museum that never got funded. Silas had kept it because something in him refused to give up the idea that healing could be seen, not just felt. That night he completed it, not for Thomas, not even for himself, but for every boy who had ever been told he was unfixable, and for every man who had ever learned that standing again wasn't about muscle or metal, but about reclaiming the ground where you once fell. Silas still hadn't decided what he would do with the leg he gave Thomas, whether he would leave the name tag inside, whether he would ever return to Bridge Hollow. But a door had opened, and ghosts, once faced, had a way of turning into steps. Word travels fast in places that used to feel like home. Bridge Hollow, once just a name Silas tried to forget, suddenly began circling back into his life, not through letters or phone calls, but through veterans who had passed through his workshop and returned with whispers. That quiet young man in Detroit with the steady hands, he helped me walk again. He doesn't charge full price. He works miracles. Then came the email, not from Thomas, from the town's American Legion post. They were hosting an annual Veterans Day memorial and had chosen to honor Thomas Quinn for both his service and his remarkable recovery. They requested a short video about the prosthetics design. Just a few words, a tribute. Silas stared at the email for a long time. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, heart heavy with the weight of 1,000 untold truths. He could have ignored it, but something in him stirred. Not anger, not revenge, something deeper. A need to reclaim his own version of the story before it was buried under medals and ceremonies. He didn't reply. Instead, he began filming. Each night after work, Silas sat alone under a single desk lamp in the workshop and spoke to the lens. At first, the words came slow, stiff, like rusted bolts being turned after years of disuse. He talked about engineering, about how balance was more than weight distribution, it was trust. About how prosthetics weren't just tools, but quiet promises that movement was still possible. Then he paused, swallowed, and shifted. He began to speak, and not about limbs, but about a boy. A boy who was told he was broken for loving differently. A boy who fell down stairs not because he tripped, but because someone made sure he wouldn't stand tall again. A boy who woke up in pain and stayed silent so no one would see the family name tarnished. That boy had no medals, no support, no flag to wrap himself in, but that boy survived, and he grew up to give people back their legs. The final video was 6 minutes long, raw, unpolished, no background music, just Silas, face partly in shadow, speaking with a voice that trembled only once when he said, "The man who walks with my work now once left me unable to walk at all, and yet I chose to build him a future he never gave me." He didn't send it to the Legion. He uploaded it to his website, quietly, no headline. Just a title, a note on legacy. 3 days later, it went viral. Not because he asked it to, but because a young journalist from a veterans mental health group saw it, recognized Silas from a past story, and reposted it with the caption, "The bravest thing I've seen this year wasn't on a battlefield. It was in a workshop in Detroit." Suddenly, emails poured in. Former clients wrote to thank him again, now not just for the prosthetics, but for the courage to speak. Survivors of domestic abuse reached out, telling him they had shared his video with their own families. LGBTQ+ teens in small towns sent anonymous messages, "You're the reason I told my truth today." Bridge Hollow's Veterans Day ceremony went ahead as scheduled. Thomas Quinn walked on stage to accept his award. The town applauded, polite and proud. But halfway through his speech, someone handed him a tablet. No one knows what exactly he saw. Maybe it was the title of the video. Maybe it was Silas's face, older now but unmistakable. Maybe it was just a line in the transcript that hit harder than expected. Whatever it was, Thomas didn't finish his speech. He simply stood, silent, the award trembling slightly in his hand. He left without applause. Meanwhile, in Detroit, Silas didn't watch the ceremony. He was back in his workshop, molding a new design for a girl born without a right hand. He focused on the curve of her palm, the way her fingers used to rest when holding a pencil. He worked in silence, not because he was hiding anymore, but because the quiet now felt different, softer, like space had finally opened where shame used to live. That night, he went to bed early, not to escape, but to rest. For the first time in years, he dreamed not of falling, but of running. Months passed. Silas Quinn didn't return to Bridge Hollow. He had already done what he came to do, not in person, but through the truth he carved into the silence. He didn't need to be there to watch old narratives collapse. He didn't need to witness who finally whispered, "I never knew," or who still insisted. That couldn't be true. Truth, once released, has a way of breathing on its own. In Detroit, things didn't get quieter, they got deeper. The workshop, once just a place of making and mending, slowly became something more. People didn't come just for prosthetics. They came to talk. Veterans stayed after fittings. Parents brought their sons, not just for legs, but for words. Queer teenagers showed up pretending to be volunteers, just to be near someone who had stood up in a way that didn't require noise. Silas didn't want to become a symbol, but symbols don't get to choose. What he did choose was to use the attention while it lasted. With the help of a few foundations and hundreds of small donations from strangers who had seen the video, he launched a pilot program, the Reclaim Project, a space where trauma survivors, amputees, and queer youth could build, learn, and heal with their hands. Not therapy by name, but therapy by making, by welding, by stitching, by sculpting strength into something you can hold. The first student he took in was a trans boy named Ezra, nervous, eyes always on the floor, arms crossed like armor. He reminded Silas of himself, not in how he looked, but in how he tried to disappear. At the end of the first week, Ezra built his own set of finger extensions out of soft polymers and whispered, "I think I'm gonna be good at this." Silas didn't respond right away. He just handed him a small metal badge and said, "Make your name permanent on everything you create." That became the rule in the workshop. Every piece, every project had to carry a name. Not a logo, a name. A mark that said I was here, and this came from me. One day, Silas received a small package in the mail. no return address. Inside was a worn-out military jacket, the same one Thomas used to wear, folded neatly, with a note that read, "You built me something I couldn't earn. I'll never ask again. I hope this repays a piece of what I broke." Silas read it once. Then he placed the jacket, without ceremony, in a donation bin for unsheltered vets. What he needed from that man had already been taken back. He stood by the window that night, looking at the lights of the city, his own legs, now lined with reinforced alloy, hummed with quiet current. He had designed them to carry more than weight. He had designed them to remember. Behind him, the walls of the workshop were now covered in photos. Smiling clients, kids holding up their first builds. Journal headlines, a frame with the words, "Don't just survive, build." Silas never planned to be seen, never planned to come out twice, once as gay, and again as a survivor. But he did, and by doing so, he made space for others to stop hiding. As the wind passed through the cracks in the old brick walls, he closed his eyes, not to shut the world out, but to hold it in for a moment, because this wasn't the life he was given, it was the life he built. And now I ask you, what part of your story have you hidden so long? It started to feel like it never existed. Maybe it's time to reclaim it. If this story touched something in you, don't forget to subscribe to Heart Stories. Here, every story is built from truth, and every truth deserves to be heard.